Good morning, good afternoon, good evening everyone, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us for the monthly question and answer session. It's been a little bit difficult recently with all the things going on, retreats, etc. So we haven't been able to do a full question and answer session for a while. So today what I thought I would do is I would ask questions live from the chat, give people an opportunity to ask whatever they like. Normally we use this Google form, and if you submit something in a Google form, then it's quite likely that it won't be answered today anyway, because there's a backlog of questions, quite a few coming up. And hopefully what we'll have in a moment is some questions for the chat to answer. As you know, then recently we completed our first silent retreat here in British Columbia, and that was well attended from people all over the world, as far as Germany and Argentina. And I have to say I was quite pleased. The reason why I was pleased is because it seems the people who attended were quite serious about what they were doing. They committed themselves to the practice, even though it was challenging for quite a lot of people. I mean, physically challenging in ways, because they're not used to basically sitting for that much time. I think quite a few people, you could say, would have been maybe meditating for half an hour maximum per day, and by the end of the 1 week retreat, then everybody was doing 6 hours. And I think the feeling is sort of like, well, I could never do that. I couldn't do 6 hours a day. That's impossible. But what you realize, if you kind of take things methodically, step by step, then anybody can develop a kind of dedicated and sincere practice. And the other thing you notice is the benefits of doing that. I mean, in general, we think if I do half an hour a day, then over 4 days, that's the equivalent of doing 2 hours meditation in 1 day. But it's not like that, because it's the more time that you spend, like in the day meditating, then exponentially there's more results for that. And part of the reason why is because a lot of what we do in our day is undoes our spiritual practice. So you meditate for half an hour in a day, and then you go to work for 8 hours, and you do worldly things for most of the day, and you go to bed. You're just basically undoing your meditation the whole time. And so if you do 2 hours a day, 3 hours a day, 4 hours a day, then proportionally you're spending more time in your practice. And then that has more holding power. There's more influence on your life. And I was pleased also because it seemed that people got the point. In general, most people got the point. So, did you get any questions, Mary? Sorry, I'm waiting for people to submit their questions. And so what I'm saying is that I recommend to you, if you get the opportunity, to yourself, do a retreat, do some dedicated practice. We have another one coming up in October here in British Columbia. That's 15th of October to the 22nd, I think. You can find the details on the website. As usual, then it's a free retreat. We're not charging for that. But we do expect people to make a commitment. And so in general then we need like a deposit. But if you don't have money, if you're unemployed, you're on low income, that's also okay. Then we can waive the deposit. The problem is that we need some kind of assurance that you're actually going to show up. It's actually very problematic if people say they're going to come and then they drop out at the last minute. What I found is, unless people are making, financially committing themselves to it, then they don't kind of feel like they've got any reason. If they suddenly change their mind, then that's okay. And that's not good. So, the force welder asked, if self doesn't exist, who suffers? So this is a really similar question to others that we've received in the past. For example, people say, if there's no self, then who gets reincarnated? And it's predicated on the notion that in order for there to be suffering, there needs to be something called a self. So it's kind of an assumption, right? That if there is the experience of suffering, then there must be one who suffers. The thing is, there's no logical reason or no proof to justify this statement, that there needs to be a self in order for there to be suffering. What we have to look at is what we mean by self. Now, in the recent retreat, we did a lot of practice that was related to the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And part of that is being aware of mental events and phenomena. And within phenomena, there are also mental events. And what happens is when you invest your time, like a significant amount of time, to looking into this process, then what you see is that we experience these succession of different kind of perceptions. Phenomena, you could call them, things that arise to sense perceptions. And that this stream is kind of unending and continually changing. It's not permanent. There's never one permanent, fixed experience that never changes. And suffering is included within this category. If we have pain, for example, right, there's the experience of pain. This is an exercise we did in the recent retreat. We have these raw experiences of pain, for example, in the knees when you're sitting for a long period of time. So there's this feeling, and it's either a pleasant feeling, an unpleasant feeling, or a neutral feeling. And the easiest one to identify is pain. So we've got this pain, and then once that is identified, once that's perceived, what happens is we cognitively get involved. And the usual response is to resist that pain, is to not accept that pain. And that process of not accepting that pain is what creates our suffering. And so what I asked the students to do was to look at this process. First, we just looked at the raw experience, pain in the knee, itch on the head, warm sensation on the bum, whatever it was, grumbling in my tummy. And so first we just see this cycle of different experiences, like raw feelings that arise in the body through sense perceptions. And then there's the way that we get involved and we interact in that. And that itself becomes a process. And that process perpetuates what we call suffering. Pain itself is not suffering. The experience of pain itself is just something that arises to your sense perceptions. Suffering is when we identify with a self that rejects this experience. And so the experience of suffering rises on the basis predicated upon a mistaken notion of self. So the question is, if self doesn't exist, who suffers? Well, the answer is, with a notion of self, there is suffering. So in general, in the Buddha Dharma, then what happens is, we ask questions of the nature of reality, and generally we ask the wrong questions. We don't know how to ask questions. We ask questions based on what are called our first principles, our underlying assumptions of the way things are. For example, we will say something like, where do thoughts come from? That's predicated on this notion that there is something called a thought and that it arises from somewhere. So Mary, you're just going to have to help me. You said it's in the DM, but are you talking about a DM on the live stream? Or did you paste it into our chat on the Discord? Because that's where I'm looking for it. Discord. Well, Discord, I click on your name, Carmen Nudibranch, and I don't see anything. So where else would I look for DM? You have to excuse me. I'm not very good. Okay, is it the message box? Oh, okay. Yeah, I see it. All right. Sorry about that. You have to excuse me. I'm new to Discord, and I'm of a different generation. So, I don't know how to use these things. It's all new to me. Yeah. No, I was referring to our personal one-to-one direct messaging chat between you and me, not in the server itself. That's fine. I found it. Yeah. So we don't know how to ask questions because we ask questions based on our assumptions, like where did the universe come from? If nothing exists, where did everything come from? These sort of questions. But these are predicated on an assumption of, for example, what existence is, what non-existence is, the fact that something can arise. Really, if you look at it, if somebody says to me, this happens a lot, say, how was your meditation going today? Oh, well, it was okay, but I couldn't meditate because all these thoughts were coming in. And then the teacher says, where did the thought come from? And the student has to go away, and then the student has to look to see where thoughts come from. And what you discover is that you don't find anywhere where thoughts come from. You don't see this process of thoughts coming. What we've done is we've conceptualized the idea of a thought coming in. And then when you're asked about it, then we realize that what we said was a fallacy. Well, hopefully, if you're a good student, you realize that it was a fallacy. So it's similar, right? You say, if there's no self, then who is it that suffers? And then I would have to ask you, what do you mean by self? Do you mean the experience of, the raw experience of pain as a self? Or do you mean that this resistance to the pain, not wanting it, is the self? And then the more you investigate this question about what I mean by self, the more you realize that this notion of a self is something that is imputed or predicated upon the five aggregates. So many of you will know what the five aggregates are, but some of you won't, so I'll just kind of briefly explain it. We have this notion of a psychosomatic complex. That's the mind-body continuum. It's made up of physical form and mental events, basically, these two things, but they're divided into five in the Buddha Dharma. And we have this idea that the self is possessed, or the possessor of these aggregates. But if you look independently at any one of these, then what you discover is you don't find the self. But we have a really hard time with this, because we're so fixed on the idea that there has to be this thing that is an experiencer in order for there to be experience. And we shelve, if any questions about that, we shelve them. We don't address them directly. And so I could ask you, why does there have to be an independent thing called a self in order for there to be the experience of suffering? That's another way of answering the question. Okay, so let's see what we got here. Where do I find a Dakini's hair? Are you getting my message? Where do I find a Dakini's hair? If results are dependent upon causes and causes dependent upon results, there must be a connection between cause and effect. Okay, so first you have to understand what we mean by Dakini. Now conceptually, in Tibetan Dharma, then it's seen to be very similar to this notion of angels, society of angels. You see these kind of beings, sky-goers, etc., who have magical powers. People think these things are like Dakinis. My own teacher, when he talks about ultimately what Dakinis are, then these are basically thoughts. In fact, all things are thoughts. And then conceptually, these various different entities, the five Buddhas, the five Buddha consorts, the Dakinis, Yidams, they're all manifestations of thoughts. And it's predicated on the existence of thoughts that we have various conceptual experiences of the world. But in the West, then we kind of get fixated on these things, and then we want to go look for some kind of artifact as something really auspicious. So then people go out to the East and they try to buy these kind of artifacts. But ultimately, this is not important. External appearance is not important. What we need to come to understand is the nature of mind. And if you've done the practices of the yogas, on the channels, winds and drops, then you will get some kind of insight into what is meant by Dakinis, etc. If results are dependent on causes, causes dependent on results, there must be a connection between cause and effect. However, if there is a contact between a cause and effect, then the cause and the effect would exist at the same moment, which seems impossible. If there is no contact between cause and effect, how can we determine the result is directly linked to the cause? So this is kind of a typical logical argument somebody's read, and it mainly comes out of the writings of Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti, etc. And this is refuting the existence of causes and results. So provisionally we talk about causality in terms of linked things, like a cause that leads to a result, and they're being linked. But then the Prasangika, Madhyamaka, that's middle way consequentialists, really for the purpose of getting students to understand the meaning of experiencing the meaning of emptiness, then they refute the existence of causes and results. You have to understand is that karma, cause and results, is taught to be provisional. It's not taught to be ultimate. So in terms of provisional reality, there's nothing wrong with saying there's a link between causes and results. But in terms of the ultimate analysis, then it's flawed. But the point is, being ordinary beings, ordinary individuals who have not realized the true nature of emptiness, and understanding a few words from Chanakirti doesn't mean you've understood the meaning or you've realized the meaning of emptiness, then we have to be very careful with cause and results. So famously you see Padmasambhava, Guru Rinpoche said that you should have a view that is high as the sky and conduct that is fine as flower. And what it means by that, we have to pay meticulous attention to our actions. And the mistake that many people make, and this is how they become non-dual zombies, a phrase that I'm happy to have coined, then what they do is they hear all these high views, nothing exists, nothing is real, and what they do is they develop a nihilistic viewpoint, and giving rise to a nihilistic viewpoint, then they engage in all kinds of weird conduct, and they get themselves into trouble, and they experience a lot of suffering based on that. So the important thing is to pay a lot of attention to karma, cause and effect, and then in terms of what this interlocutor has asked, then if you want to come to understand the nature of emptiness, you have to study these logical arguments, but more than that, then you have to apply it in practice through contemplation and meditation until you realize this truth. Because really it's no use to you saying there is no link between causes and effects, because until you've realized the truth of that, you're always going to suffer. And my teacher Kepalab was really good for this. You know, when students say something like that, then he'll usually take his mallow out and sort of whack them on the head or something and say, okay, there's no result from the action I just did. What's your answer to that? And that's kind of really how it is. Because for us, the experience of pain and suffering is visceral. And the danger of engaging in negativity is very kind of apparent. It's acute. So it's wonderful. You know, I wish everyone could come to realize the meaning of emptiness as taught in the Prasangika school. But it's, you know, it's not as easy as understanding a logical argument. Okay, I've got a question coming over the Zoom feed from Steve. I have a technical question. If results are dependent on cause and cause are dependent... Oh, no, this is the same one. Yeah. So, your question did come through, Steve. You can think about this in terms of the present moment of awareness and the succession of discrete moments of awareness in a continuous experience. It's the same thing. If there was an actual real narrative, I mean, we believe that there is a real narrative because we remember things. And so we see this continuum of experience from past, present to future. But it's the same point. We did a lot of work on this in the recent retreat, actually, on Salt Spring, because we were looking at the present moment of awareness. And what I said then, and I think it was briefly covered in some of the extracts, was that what we experience is a discrete moment of awareness, but we conceptualize that into a continuum. So we conceptualize things existing in past, present, and future, and by that we construct a narrative, and that narrative causes us to suffer. And the Vajrayana then talks that all experience is pure, like the negative emotions are pure, etc. This is related to this point. And this is where people also fall into a trap, because they hear this high view, there is no good or bad, everything is pure, but for themselves they're trapped in this conceptual world of stringing together disparate moments of experience and constructing a narrative out of it. And so it's meaningless for them to say that everything is pure because their view is based on non-purity. Purity is recognizing the true nature of phenomena, that's recognizing authentic reality. And that, we could say, loosely means recognize the present moment of awareness. So many teachers say, oh, it's easy, it's very easy, all you need to do is rest in the present moment, there's nothing more than that. And then students wondered why it doesn't work. That's because we don't understand what the present moment is. And this is what happens in meditation. Then we sit there, we conceptually understand that there's these disparate moments of experience, that we're confabulating them as being a narrative, and then we sit in meditation, I'm going to rest in the present moment, and we try to catch the present moment. And that it's like equally self-deceiving. Anyway, it's a danger, something you need to watch out for. Asacha Chito says, what if we take a radical step? What if we just allow the past to be and greet this moment with a transformed and completely fresh childlike curiosity? So this is from Ajahn Anando. Is this something that you posted in the direct chat, Mary? Or is this a DM from somebody else? Yeah, I'm getting messages from other people in the DMs. I think it's better if you just paste it to me directly in our chat that's between you and me on Discord. Okay. So I'm going to look at the chat window and answer a question there. Nona me now. Lama, I see a lot of light points floating in my house, especially when I am recording my cats. Do you think what or who can be? Can you talk a little about it, Dakinis, please? So, somebody says dust in camera lens refracting light. So somebody in the previous retreat from Germany, then she visited a Theravedic temple. And there they do pujas, right? They don't do as much as the Tibetans, but they still do these ceremonies. And one of them is inviting the devas. And the devas are beings in the form realm, really. That's what we're talking about. And so they take pictures. When they do this ceremony, then they take pictures randomly around the room. And then when they look at the pictures, then there's all these little points of light. They've got a kind of halo around them. I mean, they could be some defect with the camera, but they don't look like it. But what they say is that these are the devas, and what they appear as like beings of light. I think that's often how they're seen as divine beings, that they have a form, but the form is subtle, and it's just energy or light. And so I've seen these pictures, and they're quite impressive. I mean, I can't say that they're not just a flaw of photo optics, or they're faked. I don't think they're fake, because they just took the pictures and showed them, shared them. But it could be that you're seeing devas. It could be dust motes. In Tibetan, we always talk about dust motes. That's when you look through the sun and dust catches a beam of the sun and it appears like these little floating dust. It depends very much. I think some people are very sensitive to this, for certain. I mean, some people kind of encounter Dakinis. Other people don't see them. You can ask, did you see that? And they didn't see it. Some people are sensitive to it. I do believe in this just because in the past, and I've met people who are kind of seem to be a little bit clairvoyant, and they know things that can't be explained. It tends to mostly be women, and some are very kind of intuitive. And some people encounter ghosts very easily and encounter other beings. I'm not like that. I'm not that type. But I've met people who are like that. So it's altogether possible. And regarding Dakinis, then in Tibet they've got this tradition of Dakinis they're manifest as beings. And my Lama has talked about this quite a lot, because in his area of Tibet, which is a very wild and isolated area of Tibet, then they have these kandros or Dakinis, people call them. And the villagers and things usually go to them for advice or blessings or for prophecies. And he remembers very clearly when he was young being brought to see one of these Dakinis. And he was, as a young child, he was just like amazed by this woman. And she, for example, one day, there's all these mountain lakes, right? They're nearly zero. The water is almost frozen. It's so cold, right? And one day she just took all her clothes off and she walked into the lake and disappeared. She stayed there for weeks and didn't come out. And the locals were like, what happened to her, the Dakini? And eventually she came out. I don't know what she was doing. But they generally, when you hear these stories, they're going to see like, you have these Shin or land deities, Sadak, these sort of things. They're like spirits who control mountaintops and lakes and stuff like that. So there's often stories of these Dakinis going to visit the local land deity to ask them to stop causing trouble or to ask them for a favor. I mean, my own teacher doesn't get into these supernatural things very much. He's really kind of anti all this because what he sees is that a lot of people get carried away. So he hardly ever talks about it. But having been in retreat for 8 years, well, 12 years with him, then I have heard a lot of stories. And occasionally he will tell a story. He wouldn't normally, but because we've been together for so long, then I hear all kinds of things. And his own uncle had a relationship with one of these kind of land deities. I guess they're like a spirit or something. Or most of the Asians believe in it. I mean, even when I went to Korea, then every single temple's got its shin. It's a shrine for the local god of the mountain and stuff like that, and they make offerings. So most Asians believe in this really, really, really strongly. And his uncle had some relationship with one of these land deities, and they made like deals, sort of like, if you do this for me, then I'll do that for you. And so he'd always things would just show up. He would get things, and nobody would know where it come from. And they're like in the middle of nowhere, right? They're nomads who are like in the middle of nowhere, really isolated place. And especially then, it's a little bit different now. There's roads and things in Tibet now. But his uncle one day showed up with a whole herd of yaks. I think it was 200 or 300 yaks. It's not the sort of thing you can just find randomly, in the middle of nowhere in Tibet. And he said that he got them from, it was a deal he'd made with his land deity. He disappeared, and then when he showed up again, disappeared for days. When he showed up again, he had this whole herd of yaks that he had gotten from this land deity. And there were many stories. But like I say, my own teacher isn't superstition. He doesn't like talking about these things because he doesn't see it to be that beneficial for people to get really hung up on supernatural stuff. It's good inspirationally. It can be inspiring for people. If they've got genuine faith, it can be quite inspirational and help people to dedicate themselves to the practice. But if you've read the sutras, then you know that Buddha said that the miracles are the worst form of teaching. They're the lowest form of teaching. And when the Buddha enacted this, we've got this festival of miracles that the Buddha did, it was really because he was trying to defeat these Tirthakas. He was trying to establish the supremacy of Buddhism, because the Tirthakas had basically said, look, we have higher realization, we've got all these miraculous powers. And the Buddha then accepted their challenge and had this kind of competition of miracles. But in Buddhism, it's taught to be the worst thing, really. You don't want to just give people sensational, supernatural things to make them believe. They need to generate belief through what's called informed faith. So through study, through looking at logical reasonings, and people develop this confidence in the Buddha Dharma, and that's better, that's a much stronger way of doing it. So there's something called Gesar in Tibet. This is related, and people like this kind of stories and tales. And so Gesar is kind of like, if you've ever seen these kind of Iranian, these Persian tales of Gilgamesh and stuff like that, right? It's like a mythical king, Gesar. And so there's all these stories associated with this mythical king, and they would have all these kind of folk tales, and it's all attributed to this mythical king who was like the founder of Tibet, etc. But there's something called Gesar, it's a phenomena, and that's where, let's say there's a shepherd or somebody, a shepherd, and in Tibet these shepherds, they get sent off on top of the mountain with a herd of animals, and they just have to stay there for days and look after them all on their own, right? So the shepherd will disappear. They'll just disappear one day and nobody knows what happens to them. And then maybe a week or 2 weeks later they'll show up. they'll be found. Oh, what happened to you, Dorje? And they say, oh, I was minding my sheep, and then I saw this really tall guy, and he said, come with me, I have something to show you. And I followed them, and we went underground. So it sounds very much like these northern shamanic tales. And he would go to their kingdom, which is the same thing that Khenpo Labu's uncle had said. He'd met this kind of, really big, shining character, like godlike figure, and followed him. And so they would disappear, they come back, they tell the story, and the thing that's significant is that when they come back, their head is filled with these really complex tales. And what's really significant about this is that these shepherds, for example, they're illiterate, right? They can speak colloquial Tibetan, which is really, really kind of like slang, basically. And they can't read or write. And they certainly can't speak High Tibetan, right? They can never read scriptures or understand what's being said in the scripture. But when they come back, they've got these like thousands and thousands of volumes of information that they've suddenly put in their head. And it's all really highly educated. It's like classical Tibetan, perfect in its grammar, etc., and with great detail, and it'll be a tale, a Gesar tale, basically, one of the tales of these kings. And there's just absolutely no way that this can happen. If you've got somebody who's never been educated, who's illiterate, who can't read or write, all they know is sheep and yaks and cheese and tents and stuff like that, and they come back and they've got all this vast amount of knowledge, and they can sit there every day and they'll just sit in the village and they'll tell these tales spontaneously, without ever, without even pausing, without having to think about it. And so to me, this is pretty convincing, and it's really common, and it's common to this day. It still happens quite regularly in Tibet. So, Guru Rinpoche spoke a lot about the spirits in Tibet and taming the spirits, and so it seems quite likely. But it's difficult, right? I think it's good to remain skeptical, and many people are. And I think that's really healthy in the Buddha Dharma. And these kind of fantastic tales aren't much use to you, but they can be inspirational. I mean, I've always been very skeptical, and my teacher, Akon Rinpoche, then he collects a lot of artifacts. There's something called namchak. Namchak is basically sky metal. It literally means sky metal. And they're kind of like terma, or they're things that have been manifest from Guru Rinpoche. It can be other situations, but there's this phenomenon called Namchak sky metal. Now, I think I told this story in the retreat. I had a friend in Montreal. I went to visit him, and he used to collect things, and he showed me this rock, and he said, what do you think this is? What does this look like? It looked like a chunk of rock. It was kind of melted, and then he turned it over, and it had been cut in half, and it had this amazing pattern in it, almost like a crystalline pattern in it, and it was really shiny and really clean inside, kind of a metal colored. And he said it's a meteorite. It's a nickel meteorite, and that had been split open. I thought, oh, that's really interesting. So I'd always remembered this rock, because it's something I don't know where he got it. It's been quite expensive. He collected rocks or something. So Akon Rinpoche had come into our retreat center, and he used to stay with us for a while every year. And this was before he was going off to Tibet. And one thing he did was he collected these artifacts, this namchak. And he had this dorje. I don't know if you know what a dorje is, but it's like it's, I don't have mine here, I put it away. But this sort of pattern is a double dorje. If you can see that, that's a double dorje. The one down here, that's a dorje. It's like a ritual implement. And he had this ritual implement, and he said it was like a sky treasure, sort of sky metal. And he was showing it to everybody. And I'd gone into the dining room to pick up tea or something like that, because I was doing my sessions, and I tended to stay in my room. But everybody was there because Akon Rinpoche was showing this thing. And he was showing it to people, and everybody was like, wow, it's amazing, It fell out of the sky. And I was thinking, yeah, maybe, because I'm quite skeptical, right, about this stuff. Thinking, well, you could fake that. It looked like a dorje that had been burnt or something. It looked like melted rock or something like that. But it was the shape of a dorje. It was a real dorje, but it was like a bit rough on the outside, like it had been melted. And I was getting a bit skeptical. And somebody said, oh, why did they cut one of the prongs off? Why, it's cut off. So there's these like prongs on it, right? Here. there's 5 prongs, and one of them had been cut off. And Akram Rinpoche said, oh, you have to do that when you find these treasures, because they fall out of the sky. And then when you take it, you have to cut off a bit and leave it. It's really bad luck if you just take it all and you don't leave something behind. So they cut off the prong. And then he sort of held it up, and it caught my view, because I was just walking by. I was going to go back to my room and meditate, and he lifted it up, and it's almost as if he was lifting it up to show me, but I was behind him, so he didn't, it's probably quite intentional. And I could see where it had been cut off. And the metal inside was exactly the same as that meteorite I'd seen previously, 5 years earlier or something like that, before I went into retreat. It was exactly like that nickel pattern. It's not something you could fake. It was like, that's a meteorite. It was a meteorite in the shape of a perfect dorje. And I have absolutely no doubt that was actually something that fell out of the sky. Because you just, like some Tibetan con man could get a dorje and burn it with a blowtorch, right? They probably do it all the time and sell it to Westerners. But you couldn't fake that. You couldn't carve a dorje out of a meteorite and make it look like it was natural. So, for me anyway, I believe in these things. And that has helped me. Because it has helped me to be open to the possibility of things that I would normally reject. Because my mind is very usually quite scientific. And I'm very skeptical about a lot of things. But we have to find these things ourselves in life. We have to find reasons for us to have faith and believe in the Dharma. And primarily the way we need to do that is we need to study. We need to study, and then once we study, what we'll do is we'll come to see the logic that's being presented, and then we have to ask ourselves if it's true or not. For example, the earlier question was about self, right? Well, if we want to ask a question about self, then let's look at what self is. Let's study that. Let's come to understand what we mean by self. If I say, who is you? And we sort of point to ourselves. Right? Who are you? And we point to ourselves. And we generally kind of point to the body. But at the same time, we see ourselves to be our kind of mental experience. And many people, for example, these days, they kind of feel if you take the brain out, put it in a jar, then that will still be me. It will still be me, and then I can take that and put it into another body later, and then I will continue to exist just with a different body, man's body, woman's body, whatever. And there was a quantum physicist, actually. He's a popular science author. He wrote a book called Quantum Physics Made Me Do It. It's quite interesting. But he said something really quite important, because in general, then science sees the self to be basically the actions of the brain. And so his friend, who is also a scientist, had said, oh yeah, basically, the self is the mental experience, it's the brain. And you transplant the brain into another body, and that's you, right? The body is just kind of like a temporary container. And the guy who wrote this book, made a really good question. He said, so if you had your brain in the body of a 70-year-old boy who's full of testosterone, or if you had your brain in the body of a post-menopausal woman, like in her 60s, would you still be the same self? And the scientist himself immediately got the point, because there's all this hormonal feedback interactions between the glands in the body, which gives us strong emotional responses. And those emotional responses are all part of what we identify as a self. So really, that brain in those two different bodies would have a completely different experience of self, right? So I thought that was a really good scientific way of doing it. So Tenzin says, can you give some analytical meditation on how to reduce ego? So we did this recently. This was associated with the 4 foundations of mindfulness. There are many good forms of analytical meditation. We have to look at what we mean by ego, because in the West it's often associated with this idea of ego clinging, like kind of selfishness and self-centeredness. We can also look at the idea of reducing clinging to self. And what we generally would do is we sit in meditation, and then starting with the breath, we become aware of the process of breathing. And then after that, we start looking at the various different sensations in the body. And we do this repeatedly, and what happens is we have this kind of objective experience of this kind of disassociated experience of these different perceptions that we have, feeling of itching, pain, warmth, etc. And then building on that, we can start to look at what the body is composed of. For example, the various different components, the organs, the bones, the flesh, etc. And these are things we can do when we're sitting in meditation. So we're analyzing the body to see what it's constructed of. And then we can start looking at the processes involved in the body. So I think, really, in terms of this developing a sense of, let's say, no self, maybe ego is more of a kind of Jungian term or something like that. If no self, as taught in Theravada, then the four foundations of mindfulness, there's nothing better than that, as far as I can see. Because what you come to, the conclusion you come to quite quickly is that what we have is these continually changing experiences of mental events, for example, anger, desire, pain, itching, and they're just going one by one by one by one, continually changing, sleepiness. And as you refine your practice and your analysis in this way, then what you begin to see is that there is no separate or fixed self associated with those experiences. Many religions kind of teach this self to be something that's hidden. It's something that logically exists, but that is hidden, somehow pure and hidden. But this is something that's rejected, especially in the middle way. This notion that there is a hidden element, something you cannot perceive. I mean, what is experience outside of this qualia? If you know this term qualia, I think it's quite a good term. This is the, for example, the experience of redness, these sorts of things. This is what actually arises from mind. Our thoughts about this being a red flower and the experience of that redness is something different. And so when we practice the foundations of mindfulness, what we're looking at is the visceral experience itself, becoming familiar with that. And through that habituation and familiarization, what we find is that we don't experience a separate possessor of those qualities. Quite important. William says, I think Buddhism has a lot in common with Christianity. They appear to conflict, but only externally. In their esoteric traditions, they share a similar understanding of reality, of self and divine. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people see similarities between Christianity and Buddhism, and I've made videos on this topic quite a few times. Of course, there are some real obvious contradictions between Buddhism and Christianity. Fundamentally, Buddhism is what we would call an atheistic religion, and when I say atheistic, I mean especially that we do not believe in a creator God. This notion that there is a God who created the universe and everything. And this is kind of the very foundation of Abrahamic religions, is the idea of God, notion of God, and the supremacy of God. And also in Buddhism we reject this notion of the supremacy of a creator. So that's very different. But the way I approach this point is a little bit different. Because for me, it seems like what Jesus Christ was doing was introducing Mahayana principles into North Africa and the Middle East. And I mean, this is speculation, of course, but many people speculate that when Jesus disappeared for 30 years or however long it was, then he went east. He went in hiding. And many people say there's evidence in temples in Ladakh of the presence of Jesus Christ. But certainly at that time, the religion that was forefront and most prevalent was Mahayana Buddhism. So if we look at the turn of the millennia, then at that time there was an area like Afghanistan, Pakistan, this Persian area, this kingdom of Gandhara, and there Mahayana Buddhism was flourishing, and Mahayana Buddhism came in contact with all the other main religions, Zoroastrian, Jainism, Muslim, Christianity, etc. We kind of feel like at the time of Christ there was basically no contact between the East. And I think that was a narrative that the church had spun, really. And they did it for particular reasons. They did it mainly to control the trade routes into Asia. So I think it's quite likely that Jesus went and studied in these places where there was this huge exchange of knowledge between different spiritual traditions. And because of that influence, then, it's my belief anyway, this is speculation, that when Jesus returned to the Middle East, and he brought with him these Mayan principles, we see there was a big sea change in his philosophy from traditional Judaic philosophy. And he started talking a lot about love and compassion and tolerance and these sorts of things. I mean, he went into the temple and he basically said that this practice of sacrificing animals was a negative thing, and he symbolically freed the dove. And this is what the Buddha taught. So, maybe it sounds like I'm trying to take ownership of Christianity in that way. It's just my speculation. I don't say it in any way to belittle or deny Christianity, but to me there was a major change at that time. There has always been speculation about what Jesus did in those 20 years or so that are empty in Bible. Some propose a pilgrimage to India like the Prophet Mani did a couple of centuries later. Yeah, and also we know that there were the three wise men who came from the East. And so it's quite likely that this is referring to these three principal sects at the time that were meeting and discussing in these meeting halls. They had specific meeting halls designed for people from different religions to come together and discuss philosophy. And it was, for example, Islam, Buddhism, etc., and Hinduism. They would come together and they would discuss these things. So these structures existed. And the other thing that we've learned more recently, we know that, for example, at the time of Alexander the Great, then he conquered a lot of what we would consider northern India and around this area. And so there was this connection between Hellenistic Greece and the Indian subcontinent. And if you've heard of the King Ashoka, really popular, right? King Ashoka united northern India under Buddhism. He originally wasn't a Buddhist, but after giving regret to causing so many wars, and because of the influence of his wife, his queen, who was a Buddhist, and he converted to Buddhism, and he constructed many stupas to commemorate the life of the Buddha. He also made several royal decrees, and one of them was to promote Buddhism in foreign lands. So we know this exists, but recently they found some actually archaeological evidence of this fact in Athens itself, which is the existence of what we call Hellenistic Mahayanists or Hellenistic Buddhists. And so it seems that his edict, or his the Buddhist soft power of his kingdom of the time did reach as far as Athens. So although, for example, when I was going to school, there was very much this narrative being pushed that there was no connection or interchange between these different cultures significantly at that time of Jesus. It seems like there was a long-standing tradition of the exchange of spiritual knowledge, etc., scientific knowledge between Persia and Mediterranean area. And it seemed like at the time of the Venetian religious leaders, were basically merchants, that they tried to suppress knowledge of the East because their wealth was based on trade going into India and China, etc. And so they needed to... If you look at the old maps, it's really funny, because you look at the old maps, and then on the edges of their kingdom, there would always be like dragons and demons and things, and like savages and cannibals. And they intentionally drew all these in to stop people from getting curious about the East and traveling there. And Marco Polo did it, and he was punished for it in the end, wasn't he? Because he said, hey, there's a whole land out there, and it's full of amazing things. And the church didn't like that. I think that has a lot to do with it. Could you say anything... these comments are just going by so fast. Could you say anything about importance of asana? Asana Siddhi, mastery of asana, like being able to sit for prolonged periods of time without any pain, numbness in full lotus position. So asana is really important in Buddhism. You wouldn't think it, but in general we talk about this 7-point posture, etc. which is sitting in lotus position. We had a test on this recently on the retreat. I wonder who remembers the 7 points. But if you work from the bottom up, for example, you've got this lotus position. And a lot of it's got to do with keeping the spine straight. And the reason why the spine has to be straight is, if you look at the reasons in Tibetan Buddhism, it's pretty damn similar to what they teach in Kundalini Yoga in the Hindu tradition. It's because we have this principal channel in the body. We've got the right and left channels, our Alana and Rasana. And what we want to do is we want to move that spiritual energy into the central channel. And so posture is seen as being really important. If you look at the works of Marpa, the translator, for example, then he said, this is the supreme method, my 5-point posture. In his tradition, it's called a 5-point posture, but it's basically the same, right? Sitting cross-legged with the spine straight, and the hands resting in the lap, and the head balanced centrally over the spinal column with the shoulders open, etc., the position of the eyes, etc. Marpa placed a lot of emphasis on this, and so did Milarepa. There's the story of Khenpo Bodhisattva. He was one of the founders of Buddhism in Tibet, and the teacher, the scholar of Samiling, the oldest Tibetan monastery. At one point he had fallen into disfavor and he had to flee the country because they were going to murder him or something like that. It was probably these Mongolian warriors under the control of one of the opposing sects of Buddhism. So he had to leave the country at some point. And the story goes is when everything was clear, he returned back into Tibet. And when he was crossing over the border, he met a very old man in his 80s. And the old man was like, wow, I have great faith in the Dharma, and I just must be liberated from samsara. I need to be taught the supreme path of Mahamudra, but I'm too old to study. My brain is addled, and my body is all crooked and bent. And so please, Khenpo Bodhisattva, give me a method that will allow me to achieve attain realization of the Mahamudra. And Khenpo Bodhisattva, what he did was he tied him up. We have these things called meditation sticks. Well, mine's in the basement, I can't show you. But you put it under your chin, and it makes you stand very straight. And we have a meditation belt. You wrap it around your body. You've probably seen these in pictures. And so he got a stick and this belt, and then he tied up this old man. So basically he could sit completely straight. And based on that, then this old 80-year-old man achieved the Mahamudra. That's how the story goes. But of course, this old guy had to be really serious about what he was doing, right? Like if I grabbed you, okay, so if I took you, Bonnie, and I strapped you to a pole and tied you up, you would call the police, right? You wouldn't tolerate it. So the fact that he was able to tolerate it meant that he was really sincere, and so he applied himself to those methods. So yes, asana is really important. And we do yoga in retreat environments. We do the 6 yogas in Europa. And within that, there's the Tibetan Trokor, which is basically the same as Kundalini on the outside, if you look at it. Technically, it looks the same as Kundalini. The view is different. It's far more precise, far more, it's far deeper in the Tibetan tradition. That's only because it's remained intact for 1,000 years. The problem is in India is that at one point all this knowledge came into Tibet. It was all translated into Tibetan. It was done so under royal edict, so they put literally 50% of the country's GDP into just bringing Buddhism to Tibet. They created translators, libraries. So all this stuff came into Tibet, and then shortly after that there was a huge cataclysmic event in northern India that destroyed Buddhism, and all the scriptures, etc., were destroyed, and this also affected the Hindu tradition. So most of this stuff was lost. So it kind of got preserved very purely in Tibet, and that means that it's all very detailed, much more detailed than you'll find in the Hindu tradition, because it was lost. And so we apply ourselves in retreat to this pretty strenuously, right? We do the 6 yogas for 6 months. That's every day, all day long, and all night long, because you're supposed to meditate, dreaming and sleeping as well, for 6 months. And so we see it to be important, but in general, one would think, especially the Tibetan Buddhists, that they don't place much importance on yoga, etc. But it's only really kind of people who do the Lama retreats who are supposed to do this. These days, everybody's selling 6 yogas in Europa online. It's being done publicly. It's thought that this should never be done. That's really dangerous. My teacher and most of the Tibetans would be horrified, but in the West, then people are teaching it willy-nilly. I suggest you don't do that. It's up to you what you do, but if you really want to do it properly, then it's quite difficult. It's not just about the exercises. Anybody can do exercises. Anybody can do a yoga class, right? If you really want to come to understand these profound yogas, one, you have to be super diligent. You have to take it really seriously, and you need the right environment, and you need a good teacher, and that's very difficult to find. William again says, to me, the monastic tradition is every religion seems to be the best place to find common ground between religions. Yeah, I think within monasticism. It's also a good place to find the common faults in every religion, but that's a pretty deep topic. I suggest you watch my video on Monday if you've got time. Of course, you can watch it anytime you like. It helps the algorithm if you watch it early on. But it's quite a long video, and I do go into some detail about what's happening in monasteries. If you find sincere practitioners in any tradition, then you're going to find similarities. The problem is finding sincere people, and it doesn't matter if they're monastics, they can be lay people as well. We've got a great tradition of very sincere, dedicated lay practitioners in Tibet, and some people even see them to be superior to the monastics themselves. Technically in the Buddha Dharma, then the monastics are put over the Ngakpas and lay practitioners. But on this point, most Westerners aren't very clear. They get it kind of confused because we kind of skew the importance of Ngakpas or lay practitioners. But in general, these lay practitioners, they won't sit with monastics, and they will never sit above the monastics. In Tibet, I'm saying. But anyway, that's a completely different topic. Ephemeral says, I read that Epicurus started a commune movement, which most of them became Christian monasteries. I think, initially the Desert Fathers, for example, they were all living in these communes, and they were doing some pretty extreme practices that seemed very similar to yogic practices from Asia. Some of the Gnostic sects were even practicing abortion, which is quite weird. There's the Paratites, I think it was. And because they were trying to stop this process of being reborn in the world. It's quite extreme, right? In general, I think if you look at the stories of the Desert Fathers and the Gnostics, then you'll find a lot of interesting parallels between this Hindu and Buddhist yoga practitioners. Really profound, wonderful topic. It'd be nice to touch more on it in future. But unfortunately now we're coming to the end of our time. So I just want to thank you all for joining us. Sorry for being a bit chaotic today. I was just hoping I would be able to address some of people's questions directly, because the actual application form on Google is a little behind. Next month, when we do the Q&A, I'll try to get through as many of the questions as possible that you've previously submitted. I know that you don't always get your answer quickly or when you're actually there, but if you look back through the previous live streams, then you should find an answer to your question. And Sonia has been very kind to well, it's interesting, there's Richard Lee, my brother's name is Richard Lee. Sonia's been very kind to make to do some chapters for the videos, which means you can find your answers more easily. So I think what's really good is at the end of any session is that we should kind of dedicate any merit that has arisen from this action. Hopefully it's, oh that's right, Sonia, it's called timestamps. Searching for the noun. That we can dedicate any merit, if there is any, to the benefit of all sentient beings, especially those who are suffering these days with everything, all the terrible things going on in the world, frontline wars, and the people suffering in Gaza, etc. And so we turn our thoughts towards them, and we wish that anything virtuous should lead to benefit outcomes, so that we may become fully enlightened beings, and in that way have the means to benefit others suffering in the 6 realms of samsara. So until next time, and see you later.